Right, so there are a lot of reasons why this is complicated, and we know that. Here are some of the things that I've found. First of all, like trees, measurement happens and grows over time. There is an unfurling set of penumbras of impact that take place, right? You get the kid to come after school, and he comes after school so he's not on the streets. That means he's probably less likely to get involved in gangs and drugs. But then over time, the more active he is in the after-school sports program, whatever, he may develop healthy behaviors and lifestyles. That may lead to better student performance. That may lead to certain prevention of future likelihood of obesity. But all these things don't happen overnight. Right? So the one problem we face is that outcomes unfurl over time. That's one reason why this is so hard. Another reason why this is so hard is that it's really expensive to track data. It doesn't even matter whether you can buy the software, but the ability for us, for any organization, to think about what metrics do I track, how do I track them, who is in place to measure this data. The sheer mental capacity to focus on this is a big, expensive burden for organizations that we all know too well. And third, there are no standards. What does well-being mean? What is the definition of an outcome? Forget the definition of standard metrics. We don't even have standard outcomes. I mean, I was up in Canada, and we were working with one of the YMCAs up there. Andrew would appreciate this. And they wanted us to figure out, what outcomes are they trying to move the needle on. So we did all the stakeholder engagement. They were writing the outcomes on the wall. And one of the outcomes that they wrote up was like, creating global citizens of the universe. I'm like, what in the world does that mean? Like, oh, well, we're getting people to be, young people to volunteer in their community. I'm like, all right, so getting people to volunteer and be civically engaged, right? Let's just define this in normal human being terms so we know what we're saying. But I can tell you, and many of you who've done this work can tell you that every organization defines the outcomes completely idiosyncratically. And so even the standard units of social impact that we're trying to measure are difficult to track. So how have other sectors cracked this code? Because we are by no means the first. Frankly, nor are we the most complicated sector to measure. We just aren't. There are many sectors that are much more complicated. Think about personal finance, right? In the personal finance world, we don't need to wait and see whether you repay your car loan to determine your likelihood to repay your car loan. I don't need to wait for the results to happen or for the program to run its course to measure something. I can create synthetic data that pulls together a bunch of other data points about you, your demographic information, your earnings, your mortgage payments, your credit card balances, and I can predict the outcome of whether or not you will repay your car loan. Now, trust me, I hate credit scores. And I'm still trying to explain to them that 6 years ago when I got a Verizon cell phone and returned it within 30 days, that $300 shouldn't be on my credit report because, I returned it within 30 days. There are certainly some inaccuracies. However, it's directionally right, and it's a useful tool, and it saves a loan officer at a bank from going and doing due diligence on every single one of us to figure out what our likelihood of repaying a loan would be. It predicts an outcome. We also can predict outcomes in the world of health. We can take amniocentesis when people are pregnant and determine the likelihood of genetic risks for kids. We can look at someone's DNA swab, and we can determine their likelihood of having a risk for cancer or Alzheimer's or other diseases. We can predict outcomes in healthcare and be directionally right using a lot of data and research that has been amassed in that sector. We can also predict what songs people would like using data that has been amassed over time about you and about others like you. In fact, it has recently been revealed that I actually like Taylor Swift. This is my first coming out with that, so please keep it in this room. But I did not actually know that I liked Taylor Swift until Pandora told me I did. And now I'm kind of liking that song about Taylor Swift fans. In any event, we can predict health outcomes. We can predict financial outcomes. We can predict musical preferences. We can predict your interest in Netflix and certain movies. Other sectors have figured out how to predict outcomes. So here are the big ahas. Having studied those other sectors and thinking kind of topographically, holistically about what we could do. First, these sectors and these other areas have created synthetic data. Synthetic data means they have pulled together a series of attributes. Like in Pandora, your musical interests are not measured. The measurement of your musical interest is a composite of the attributes of a song that you like. So Pandora's Music Genome Project will disaggregate a Taylor Swift song into strong female vocal, rising vocal lead, heavy guitar solo, this type of tenor and this type of musical accompaniment, and they can quantify those variables. And they can find other songs that are like that. Same thing with Netflix. Same thing with Amazon, things you may like. Those are correlative associations that predict an outcome through correlations. But things like credit scores and things like the Human Genome Project can predict outcomes not through correlation, but through causation, through amassing enough data of genetic profiles of people to say that everybody who's had these genes has had this particular health outcome. Everybody who's had these particular financial factors has had this risk profile. So first, we can create synthetic data. Second, these other areas that have cracked the code on measurement have created predictive data, not necessarily retrospective data, meaning they do use data over time to hone and sharpen their predictions, but it is not about waiting until the program or the personal experience has been fully measured to approximate the outcome. That outcome is approximated on a predictive basis. Think about that. And third, these sectors have settled for approximations that are directionally right versus absolute 100% certainty and perfection. And I can also tell you that those people who have held the standard in the social sector of absolute 100% certainty and perfection, those people are wrong too. There is no such thing as absolute 100% certainty and perfection. We can have the fanciest randomized control trial of any endeavor in the world, and we can say to a statistical certainty that this particular program, under this particular set of conditions, for this particular population of people, at this particular time, under this particular set of economic factors, had this result. The external validity of those conclusions, and even the internal validity of how that study was run, pose great questions for perfection and perfect causation. So let's just throw perfect causation out the door, because we will never get there. And it is interesting to look at how science and other areas have settled on getting directionally right in the value of that standard for prediction. So what do we face in our sector? Well, how are we trying to measure social impact today? We really have two options, frankly. The first is performance measurement. All right, so let's take an after-school reading program. And we're ultimately aspiring to measure the outcome of literacy and reading proficiency. So one way that people measure that is by tracking performance measures. We will come up with some reasonable performance metrics. I mean, how often people are attending, how much they're reading, how many kids are reading with their parents. But the problem is, those output metrics don't equal an outcome. I mean, you could have a cohort of 100 kids, and 70% of them say that reading is fun. 40% of them read with their parents. Let's say on average they spend 10 hours a week reading, and 60% of the kids regularly attend. What does that mean for an outcome? it doesn't mean anything because these are a bunch of independent, uncorrelated, random performance metrics that are mostly outputs of a program. So the problem with performance measurement, as much as it is helpful to manage a program, performance metrics do not add up to an outcome. They cannot explain an outcome. And one of the things we've learned at Mission Measurement from measuring hundreds or thousands of programs is that performance measures are good management tools, but they do not explain impact. They are a very limited proxy. I serve, for example, on the Budgeting for Results Commission in the state of Illinois, and I'm working with the governor's office and the Senate appropriations chairs in Illinois to measure the impact of every state program, all 512 of them, and every grant we give. And if you ask the state about measurement, they'll say, we got that. We got tons of metrics. We measure everything. We can tell you how many carnival rides are inspected. I was like, let's just hope that's 100%. And we can tell you, the number of African American women on WIC that are breastfeeding. I'm like, right, so you're measuring the measures. We're not measuring an outcome. Well, others would say, well, we can do evaluations. That's the other option. So we can evaluate a program over time, sometimes using a control trial, sometimes using a quasi-experimental design, and we can wait till the end of the program and see what outcomes took place and know for sure that these people experienced a positive outcome. Yes, but it's expensive. We can't RCT every program in the world, and it takes a long time to see whether an outcome takes place, which is great, but that's not going to help the Senate Appropriation Committee to figure out what programs they're going to fund right now. It's not like we can wait 5 years to see if this program worked and then take a DeLorean back and then rewrite the Senate budget, which comes out in 3 or 4 weeks from the state of Illinois. We need to know now. And so we have no data to make those decisions. If you ask Heather Staines or Senator Katowski, who run the appropriations committees on the Senate and state of Illinois, they will tell you that they have a very clear formula for how they determine what social programs they fund in the state. They look at all the programs that we funded last year, and then they cut them by 10%, refund them this year. Literally, that's what we do, because we're waiting for 5 years to get an evaluation study to see what works. We can't live that way. So neither one of these options is acceptable for funders who are looking to answer different questions today, because funders and social investors are not looking for measurement to solve the problem of accountability, which basically means prove that you didn't waste money. That's great, but that's not really what they want to know today. What they want to know today is, I want to measure for value. Help me make trade-offs. Help me inform my decisions. Help me figure out what programs are going to give me the best bang for the buck. Help me predict what outcomes I would get if I invested in these 3 job training programs versus in those 3 job training programs. There is a fundamentally different inquiry today in social change than there was before. It isn't just the bar of making sure that people are doing what they said they were going to do. It is now an area of comparison, of benchmarking, of predictive modeling, of looking at bang for the buck, of trying to understand the overall portfolio of investments. And so we need a different way than just performance measurement and evaluation. And I'm a big proponent of the third way. So what's the third way here? Well, the third way is to do what other sectors do, which is to harness all of the data and research that we have in our sector, to codify it into factors and variables that can predict an outcome, and to derive one universal metric for every single social impact program, not only in the state of Illinois, but in the entire country, maybe even the world, which is the efficacy rate. Right? That's ultimately what we want to know. The efficacy rate measures the percentage of people that are likely to achieve a positive outcome from a program. It measures the outcome rather than measuring the measures. So now the question is, how do we actually create an efficacy rate for a program? So that's where I want to introduce the Impact Genome Project. And the Impact Genome Project came from a lot of research that we did to realize that we need to completely turn measurement on its head. from a retrospective, linear, empirical look-back type of analysis to an algorithmic, predictive, factor-based model. And in the same way that we can look at music that you like and we can look at your personal credit, we can now look at the factors, the attributes of a program, and predict the likelihood of it achieving an outcome. So if you think back to that example of after-school reading and predicting the outcome of literacy, we can look at all of these factors, the outcomes that the program aspires to achieve, the proximity to the beneficiary, the intensity, the dosage, the frequency, the duration, the type of curriculum, the evidence base, and the track record of that program. We can look at the persistence of the program and a lot of other factors. If we looked at all of the evaluation literature of every literacy program that's ever been evaluated, and we suck out all of the factors that are correlated to high efficacy rates, we would find, and we've looked at these evaluations, we would find that on average we probably find the same 30, 40, 50 factors in all of the programs that are producing outcomes. And we would probably be able to derive an efficacy band for programs that have those factors, because nothing is 100% effective, right? There's maybe 60 to 70% efficacy band in literacy, let's say. The programs that are the most highly efficacious that have these factors, we know that they're 60 to 70% effective. So I know that if the state is funding a literacy program with all these factors, and even if it has no track record, we might have some discount, but we could probably say that if they're serving 1,000 kids and the efficacy rate is about 60%, that probably 600 kids will achieve a positive outcome. It's probably not going to be 6 kids, and it's probably not going to be 6,000 kids. In fact, even if we had an efficacy band of 0 to 100%, even that would be helpful to be able to say to a legislator or a decision maker, we know that this literacy program is going to produce somewhere between 0 and 1,000 reading proficient kids. And if the program costs $1 million, we know that the cost per outcome is somewhere between $1 million and $1,000. Now, it would be absurd to have that big of a confidence interval, but we can use data to narrow in the confidence interval and to be able to get a directionally right prediction of the efficacy of a program. So the Impact Genome Project is something that we launched last month in Oxford. We'll be talking about it more here in the US. You guys heard it first through Andrew Means and the Do Good Data Project, but we launched this in Oxford earlier this, last month, and it was really fascinating. Basically, what we did was challenge the measurement orthodoxy to say, this isn't about empowering every single nonprofit with tools and software and capacity building to measure every single outcome that they're producing. We're never going to get there that way. It's just not possible. So this idea that we have to build the capacity of nonprofits to measure themselves is just not happening. Okay, I've written books, I've taught, I've consulted. We will never teach every nonprofit how to become an evaluator. It's not going to happen. No more than you can derive your own credit score. We also can't RCT everything in the world, and these shared measurement systems don't work to predict outcomes. They work to track outputs. So we launched this in April, and what we are doing now, and I invite anybody who's interested to come be a part of our research, we are first building the education genome. That will be our first genome. We will launch it later this year. That genome is being used to predict the outcomes of education programs that are funded by governments, that are funded by foundations, and ultimately nonprofits will be able to go on through the genome and do their own genomic imprint. Right? If any of you have gone to 23andMe and spit in a cup and you could get your own DNA imprint, you could do the same thing. We can run your program through the database. We can identify what factors exist in your program and in fact create your own genomic imprint. So this, which is kind of interesting, this is the back of our scorecard. I'll show you the front in a minute. But for any particular social program, we can now run a scorecard. And we can score them against all of the factors that are statistically correlated to efficacy. And we've identified here some of those key factors. And we can look in the bottom left at the key factors of this particular program that light up here on the top in your genome that are associated with efficacy, and we can derive your efficacy score. We can also identify the programs that you don't have, or the factors that you don't have that would enhance your efficacy and raise your likelihood of having a positive outcome so that you can have recommendations and figure out how to improve your program design. Is this absolutely perfect? No. But it's directionally right. And we can say within a certain level of confidence interval that if your program reflects certain attributes, factors, has a certain evidence base, has certain performance metrics, we can say what we expect the efficacy rate will be. And as you give us better data every year, we can update your efficacy rate and start to feed our benchmarks in our data system to learn over time. I had a conversation with a bunch of academics recently at Northwestern, and many of them questioned this approach and said, well, you can't know for sure, and this can't be absolutely perfect. And my answer is, you're absolutely right to both those points, but we have to start somewhere. And right now, we have all these great what works databases with all of these huge thumb-sucking evaluations that we've stored on data servers that make no sense to anybody. They're completely idiosyncratic. No one's evaluated them, standardized the data, and used it in any practical way. And it's time that we start doing this now. The other cool thing about the genome is that we can start to score programs on very simple metrics. And I would argue that we actually only need 3 metrics for any social impact program. We need to know principally what is the efficacy rate for producing a standard outcome. And we have standardized outcomes in the sector from studying 77,000 or so of them to about 4,000 standard outcomes across 1,100 different program types. So we know that there are standard outcomes. We can determine the efficacy rate for a program, which again is the number of people that go through the program that are expected to achieve a positive outcome. We can then look at the expected outcomes, which is the efficacy rate times the number of people reached. So if it's 69% and we're reaching X number of people, we know that 69% of those people will yield a positive outcome. And we can divide that by the program budget to determine the cost per outcome. And then we can create benchmarks to say, well, here's the cost per outcome of this program versus that program. And we can start to normalize that so we can help people understand, hey, if you're funding a job training program that's supposed to be producing jobs, the benchmark cost per outcome for creating a job in this state is about $2,000. This costs $20. Now, you may still want to fund that program because maybe it's producing jobs for very hardcore population, like people with disabilities or other people in very remote rural areas, and that's okay, but at least we have some bearings, some benchmark from which to make some rational decisions in this sector. So what are the takeaways? First, we are living in the time of universal measurement. We do not have to continue to pine away for standard metrics anymore and for common ways of doing this. We have common outcomes for the sector now, and we have a universal way to start to measure the sector. And over the next 2 to 3 years, you will see this, whether it's from this approach or others, happening. This thousand flowers blooming approach, if we all measure our own outcomes with our own idiosyncratic measures, just cannot persist. We have to make sense of the chaos. Second, it is not about measuring the measures, meaning trying to get all these performance measures, get them right, or standardized performance measures or shared measurement systems. Again, that's great as a management tool, but it is about standardizing outcomes and measuring the outcomes. That's ultimately what we value. The unit of social impact that people are buying are outcomes. They're not buying your program and they're not buying measures. Third, the focus is now on value, not accountability. People are not looking to measure whether or not you wasted money. They're looking to measure what is the bang for the buck for your program? What outcomes will I get at what cost? And finally, data will start to drive more market-like behavior. If you think of any other market in the world, any other capital market, it behaves very differently than our market. I mean, we're not only so many blocks away from the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And there's a market for pork bellies, there's a market for corn, there's a market for grains, there's markets for interest rate swaps and hurricane futures. There's even markets for carbon. Why isn't there a market for social outcomes? It takes three things to create a market. The first is standardized products, right? We can't buy and sell plastic if we don't talk about the same grade of plastic and the same type of plastic. We can have a standardized product now in our sector because we have standard outcomes. Those outcomes are part of an outcomes taxonomy that we have researched and promulgated that will be more and more accessible to the sector. But we have standardized outcomes in the sector. So we have standard products. The second key to a market is price transparency. I got to know what you bought that plastic for, and I got to know what I'm paying so I have some price. Well, now that we can create cost per outcome benchmarks, since we've standardized the per outcome part, we can actually create price transparency. And the third key to a market is central clearing function, where buyers and sellers can meet. All these things will happen, and they are well on their way. But the important message for you is two things. One, that it is happening. And second, that we need to understand our work as operating as a market. There is a market for social outcomes today. Governments, social investors, corporations, philanthropists, foundations are spending trillions of dollars every year trying to buy social outcomes that are very valuable to them. And we are in the business, in the nonprofit sector, of selling outcomes. That's what we do. We don't do good, we sell outcomes. And there is a market that has emerged. And this market is what I would call a social capital market, a market where we can now value outcomes, where we can buy and sell units of social impact. And your charge, your work, is that you are establishing the currency of that market. So while we may be doing God's work, and it is hard to measure, I think it's high time that we start singing from the same hymn book. Thank you very much. Yeah, sure. Andrew, I get to sit in these cushy chairs? Yeah. Okay.
The hot seat. The hot seat is known. All right, so one of the questions I have for the whole Impact Genome Project is this efficacy rate. Are we really interested in how many people improve, or are we interested in how many people improve that wouldn't have otherwise? Mm-hmm. The counterfactual.
Yeah. Well, I think what I'm noticing that people are asking for is, I'm investing in a program, how many people do we expect will achieve a positive outcome? Now, sometimes there's creaming going on, right? These are all PhDs, so their likelihood of getting a job is extremely high versus these are people that are at risk or having a lot of dependencies. But you can control for that variable. So we can control for the variable of demographic, and we can control for the variable of geography. And so an outcome isn't just, I want to create jobs, it's, I want to create jobs for people with disabilities in rural Illinois. And so that's how we would define an outcome. And so in some cases, yeah, people want an outcome for very difficult populations or very easy populations.
And you see this work like happening in what I would say like third-party intermediaries, right? So not at the organization level, but do you see the people that are creating the markets being the ones doing the analysis, or do you see that getting pushed back down to nonprofits?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, frankly, so I just taught, every year I teach a class at Kellogg to kind of executive programs and nonprofits. And this year, I changed the way I taught the class. Usually I say, here's a success equation, here are your outcomes, make up these performance metrics, and in some indirect way, they'll approximate your impact. What I told people this year is I said, listen, don't track a bunch of idiosyncratic random performance metrics. Just don't do it. Come up with your efficacy rate. Track one metric. Make it up based on all the research that you can come up with, your past track record, your experience, any third-party evaluations you've had, any third-party evaluations any other program similar to yours has had, and come up with a confidence interval around it, but put one measure in front of a funder and say, this is my efficacy score, and this is the projected impact I expect to have. So my answer, Andrew, is that I think that nonprofits ultimately will be able to start creating their own efficacy scores using data like this. I think third-party facilitators, instead of randomly just measuring with whatever metrics they come up with, can start to use centralized data like this to work with organizations to articulate the outcomes that are appropriate and the best way to derive their efficacy rate. But I will also say that at the end of the day, the trick on this is sizing the outcome appropriately for the organization and for the intervention. Right? We had this problem with some after-school program that they were saying, well, I want Gates money. Right? I want to be able to show that we're graduating from kids from high school and they're getting into college. Help me prove that, Jason. And I said, well, kids are just playing basketball after school for 5 hours a week at your program. So I can't prove that. Right? But I can prove that you're having positive youth development outcomes. And so the trick in this whole equation and this whole calculus is to size the outcomes appropriately where the intervention is reasonably proximate to the outcome you're trying to prove, instead of trying to stretch to some far attenuated outcome that has no clear connection to what you're doing. So I do think it is fully within the grasp of all of us to start to focus on what our efficacy scores are, to get those better over time, to shore up the evidence that supports that, to normalize benchmarks, to create a set of consultants and intermediaries who can help organizations not just derive that, but improve their efficacy score, which is the whole point of why we exist.
All right, we'll open up for questions right after this, but I think I'd be very curious in your thoughts. Is the market going to happen when people demand, like, is it supply side, right? Like, is it nonprofits being like, hey, we want to compete on the outcomes that we produce, or is it funders saying we want to buy outcomes and so we need you to improve it in some standard way?
Look, I will say, this is a great question, 2 points. One, in most markets, necessity is the mother of invention, right? Like, we have to find a way to be able to tie our shoes so someone invents a shoelace. But in this market, invention is the mother of necessity. Once we invent a way to benchmark social impact and measure it, everybody will have to do that. And so I believe that it is inevitable. But I will also say that it is primarily driven off the demand for social outcomes. Most of my work is working with the state government, the OMB at the federal level, huge corporations like Boeing and Unilever and McDonald's and Coke, and huge foundations that are in the market to buy social outcomes. Not because they just want to spray money around and do good, but because they vitally need those outcomes to advance their economic interest. Boeing can't build more airplanes without getting more engineers out of the Chicago Public Schools. But right now, they're guessing at what programs are going to produce that outcome. So they're just spraying money all over the city, with all due respect to Boeing. I've told them that, right? That you can't just spray money around and hope you're going to get, you need to purchase the outcomes from the best and most effective organizations that produce that outcome. And so the demand is coming from the pain in the market, which is saying, social outcomes are not just nice things to have, I have to have them. We have to create jobs. We have to be able to empower women. We have to be able to get positive youth development outcomes. So there's a market that attaches great economic value to these outcomes, and they're the ones that are demanding a more rational allocation.
And do you see, though, that one of the problems that I see in the sector is that we don't think about supply chains, right? Yeah. We don't think about, if I'm trying to produce engineers, I should really care what the middle school program is doing. And that middle school program should care what that elementary school program is doing.
It's a great point. I mean, look, Steve Jobs did not get an iPad by randomly finding a screen manufacturer, a chip maker, and a software developer and giving them some money. He said, I want to purchase the outcome of an iPad, so let me build a supply chain to produce that outcome. We have to be more sophisticated in buying the outcomes and in building these social supply chains. And that's where the market's going to be moving. It's not about mergers and acquisitions or getting nonprofits to partner. This is kid stuff. This is about, I need to produce 1,000 engineers. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give somebody who runs a charter school program $10 million to produce those 1,000 engineers. And I'm going to let them figure out what teacher training program they want, what principal leadership development program they need, what type of after-school supports and literacy programs they need to produce that outcome. But I am buying an outcome, and the people that are the recipients are going to be the people who are best positioned to produce that outcome. So you will get a lot more money, and you will have a lot more autonomy if you are in the business of selling impact than begging for charity. And this is your opportunity to do that.
Do you have any questions before we get up here?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So the question is, what if there aren't buyers for your outcomes? I think two things will happen. One, there's a market, right? For example, there's one organization in Utah that was trying to help immigrant women resettle in Utah. And she's like, no one wants to give me money for what I'm doing, right? So I think there's two answers to that question. One is, there is a market, so some outcomes have more value than others in this market. So one option is to raise the value of that outcome by educating people about why that's so important and the economic effects or the vitality of why this outcome is critical. The other answer is to bootstrap your outcome to a higher value outcome and put it together. So for example, no one may value that much the outcome of giving coats to homeless people. It's a really nice thing to do, but it's not that valuable. But property developers in a blighted neighborhood of Chicago might value the outcome of eradicating homelessness. So if the coats to homeless program group partners up with the homeless resettlement program and job training housing thing, and they produce the higher value outcome of eradicating homelessness that raises property tax values in that neighborhood, now all of a sudden you've bootstrapped to a higher value outcome. So I think there are some creative ways to raise the value of your outcome.
Yeah, I think.
What about something then in disaster relief recovery that you're dealing with all kinds of variables? Like, I really like the Genome Project, but if I think about it that way, I have a harder time getting my head around it.
Right, so let's take that example, right? Like there's a tornado that hits some area and you're trying to figure out what program to give money to. If we look at the world through the lens of outcomes, we would say, okay, well there's several outcomes that I care about in a disaster recovery situation. I want to stabilize individuals immediately. I want to increase their access to health care. I want to provide economic resources for them to rebuild their lives. I want to create jobs, whatever it is. And there's probably research that shows that in every other disaster situation, granted maybe a different country, a different area, that these particular factors lead to these outcomes. So if our goal is to be able to help economically stabilize people who have been displaced, we might be able to say that, okay, the research shows that the 5 best ways to do that, to create economic stability in a post-disaster thing, is to provide access to this, do this, provide them a stipend for that, partner them up with whatever. So it's not about prescribing the activities, but it's about figuring out what attributes, what factors will lead to the effective production of an outcome. That said, in some of these situations that are just so random and immediate and urgent, where we're not systematically aiming at working over time to produce an outcome, it may be less valuable to try to normalize or control variables in a very chaotic situation like that. So I think we need to start with the things that are a little bit more systematic. We have a lot more data and research. But over time, I think most human behavior and most social outcomes, we can start to look at the research and predict.
Yeah, go ahead.
So in that case then, this is because I take AGPR personally, that you would look at issues that are more base that would be like infrastructure, rather than it would put it from a funding decision, it would put more resources to earlier intervention.
So you should have done this before the earthquake kind of thing?
Right, so I'm just wondering,
Yeah.
like, I know you're looking at shifting the shape of the way things are funded, but it also sounds like there's going to be some implications in where organizations have their interventions too, like in this case, evidence and choice.
Well, I hear your question. I think there's two things. First of all, I don't think any of us should prescribe what outcomes people value. Some people might simply value the outcome of putting a Band-Aid on a situation. Just flood the situation with meals ready to eat and, basic first aid. I don't think we need to prescribe whether it's a good or bad outcome. Some people may value that outcome, in which case there's Doctors Without Borders, there's Red Cross, there's all these people that are aiming to produce that very outcome of immediate relief. But who's actually looking at the cost per outcome of one program versus another and saying how much bang for the buck are we getting? So I think it starts with what outcome you're trying to buy and then trying to figure out who's best producing that. I'll give you one quick anecdote before we go to the next question. There was a company that we were working with that was really excited about working with one of these charities that was doing cleft palate surgeries. And they were so excited. This is one of the famous brand name ones that you know. And they said, we really want to give money. Can we check it out, right? So we looked, and we found that last year the organization spent $70 million. Now, 30 million of that was fake money, like donated time of doctors. But even assuming it was 40 million of cash, and even holding aside the fact that 14 million of that was spent on fundraising costs and other things, $40 million was spent on this program. Now, we asked the program how many kids got a positive outcome, right? Not how many kids were reached, but how many kids got a positive outcome. And they said, oh, we helped thousands of kids through the years. I'm like, okay, well, how many kids got a positive outcome last year? Oh, 1,500. Okay, well, the cost per outcome for that was something like $50,000 per kid. I mean, you could literally send those kids first class to the Mayo Clinic, pay the full rate card, and send them home with $5,000 in their pocket and still be ahead of the curve. We have absolutely no idea what good means. We're just randomly looking at someone's annual report or what all these things. So my point is, it doesn't matter what outcome you're looking for. Every outcome we can understand from a cost per outcome point of view and create those benchmarks. And I do think we need to start asking those questions.
Question from, all right, right here.
Thank you very much. It sounds like what you're describing is very disruptive technology and by creating market. I wonder if that could lead to increased volatility in how money flows to nonprofits. And if that volatility could affect the scale of programs, which might destabilize your ability to get the outcome that you're paying.
Spoken like a true hedge fund trader. I like that. That's a great question. I mean, look, first of all, I don't think that this is going to happen overnight. I think it's going to be evolutionary. Secondly, it will change the way funding works for the better. Like right now, there's so much volatility. There's 100% volatility. We have absolutely no bloody idea whether that foundation is going to give us a grant. We're just hoping that maybe this guy had a good day and he's going to return our call because he met a board member and he might give us $25,000. I mean, it's ridiculous. So the volatility is through the roof. I don't think we get more volatile. But second, I think that what we will find is that as things get more rational, we can plan things better. We can start to chase resources better. And I think some funding will be disrupted, but I think some other funding will start to be more standardized. Contracts, social impact bonds, performance-based contracts, things that relate to some rational delivery of an outcome with an economic motive attached to it. So I think while you may see volatility, I don't think it's going to happen overnight. And I do think that the fact is we're already living in a market. We just don't realize it. There is a value for the outcomes we're producing. There are people who are buying outcomes, and we're all selling outcomes. We're just not calling it that. But I think as we start to standardize it, normalize it, control it, I actually think it will get less volatile. It's a very good question.